All right, he is back for a second time. He loved the questions the first time. We got him. We begged him to come back because he is a fantastic congressional reporter over at the LA Times, and that is Nolan McCaskill. Nolan, Mike Leon, Nick Severi, thank you so much for hopping back on the podcast with us.
Thanks for having me back.
Nolan, I want to get into a bunch of different things. We were talking off air about journalistic integrity and media literacy. We're going to get into that later on in the interview. But the first thing I want to ask you was because, I follow you on social. I know we follow each other, and you were posting a lot of the confirmation hearing of Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. You were in the room. Can you take our audience, because I watched that on television play out, and I watched senators set up props and cards and talking points, and then I saw retorts like the one from the senator from Hawaii about judges that were confirmed during the Trump era that let some pedophilia cases go by. I was like, man, this is awesome. But being in that room, can you take our audience what it was like being inside that confirmation hearing, the absurdities of some of these questions and the talking points, the highs and lows? What was it like being in that room and covering that?
It was tough. So, like, as a reporter, I'll admit that I'm cheap and I use Otter to help transcribe things and record.
Yeah, that's Otter.
So, I've got 3 cell phones and I used up all my free minutes on there trying to keep track of the hearings. I was there live listening. I was taking notes. I had C-SPAN on in case I needed to go back and double check something while I was also still trying to listen to what was being said. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity for me. I never thought I'd be covering politics, let alone being in the hearing room where, the Senate is conducting an interview basically of the first Black female Supreme Court Justice nominee. It was surreal. It was a pretty big room. You see all of the senators, you watch them flow in and out of the room throughout the day. You see their staffs with them. Me and a colleague caught Ted Cruz after he grilled Judge Jackson. We caught him checking Twitter to see what people were saying about how he performed. There's a lot that was happening. I enjoyed being in the room. Very long, just sitting down, listening to the senators in the back and forth for so long, trying to tweet out things that were interesting, maybe things that people weren't able to see on their TV screens. There were a bunch of members of Congress flowing in and out throughout the day. I think people were collecting tickets throughout the Capitol to sit in for a few minutes. So it's a great experience. Some of the questions were tough. I thought the judge, was very poised. She showcased her temperament. There were times where she seemed to be frustrated, but, I didn't see many pictures of her looking like an angry Black woman. So I think from that standpoint, it's a victory. She ultimately got confirmed with 3 Republican votes, which I thought 2 would be the max. I didn't think that Lisa Murkowski would vote for it because she's up for re-election this year. Thought Mitt Romney was only a maybe, but because he didn't support her last year, I didn't think that, he would support her this time, but I thought he was at least a potential vote for her. So I ran into Congressman Al Green, who attended, some of the hearings for a confirmation. And he asked me after one session ended what I thought, the number was of Republicans she would get. I told him 2, and to my surprise, she ended up getting 3.
This feels like an opportunity for FanDuel. Shout out. No, but Nolan, I can see as you're talking about this, that there's 2 things happening. One is, the weight of that moment historically, right? And I'm going to not do my Cory Booker impression here, but so how do you balance just recognizing the importance of what's going on, but then also as a journalist, you just flashed 3 phones, like a more credible Adam Schefter, for lack of a better phrase. And how do you also professionally stay in that same space? It's not to say that they're different, but I can see that 2 things are sort of occurring to you at the same time.
Yeah, still throughout this entire process, throughout even the presidential campaign, when Joe Biden made this pledge to nominate a Black woman to the Supreme Court if a vacancy occurred and he was elected president, we knew this moment was happening. We knew the moment was coming. We knew after Justice Breyer's announcement that he was going to retire that Joe Biden would name a Black woman. We knew throughout the month-long wait, or however long it was, that Joe Biden was going to name a Black woman. We were just waiting to figure out who it was. And then the question is, how many votes can this person get? Will COVID affect the ultimate vote? Will Ben Ray Lujan's absence, be a factor and that type of thing? What's the timeline? How soon will the Senate confirm her? So those were some of the concerns. As far as the history of the moment, you understand that as a journalist. When I was in the hearing rooms, wasn't really thinking about it unless I was tweeting out some observations. And I still haven't really taken the time to reflect on the moment. I think closest I came to when I was scrolling Instagram, and there's this page called Embracing Black Culture. And they posted a bunch of things about Judge Jackson and her confirmation. And one of the slides, somebody had commented on Twitter that journalism is very white. And so I took that opportunity to say it is very white, but, I was in the room, Sungmin Kim from the Washington Post was in the room. A bunch of people were in the room. There was a Black person from Punch Bowl. I had a photographer who's of Asian descent who was in the room taking pictures. So a lot of us were there, even if you didn't see us. We're all doing great work. We're all helping cover history. So that was really the only moment I really took to reflect. But I do recognize the importance of the moment. I've been too in the moment, trying to be present and trying to report what's happening, to really just stop and think, wow, this is something that's going to be in the history books. And, I may be in the background of a picture that shows her in the confirmation hearing room. And, this is a justice who looks like me, who has her hair locked like mine, who was getting grilled by senators I have the privilege to talk to, Monday through Thursday, since they're usually flying back home on Friday or Thursday night. So very surreal. It was great to be in the room and just to be a part of that and absorb it and help sort of shake the narrative and, talk to so many Black women and other members of Congress and other people who were involved in this process of just cheering her on and trying to fight back against partisanship and Republican attacks and all the pedophilia stuff. So it was great to be in that moment.
That is great to hear. And I was following a lot of your tweets, and obviously you mentioned about one of those incidents with the Ted Cruz thing. There was people that were trying to be like, no, that didn't happen. And then you were posting some receipts. I want to get into, you mentioned President Biden in that, because President Biden obviously recently did the presser on ghost guns and what he wants to do or enact legislation wise with respect to ghost guns and what the DOJ is going to do. What do you think of this now that Congress is on this 2-week hiatus? What do you think of this recent legislation, the presser that happened a couple of days ago or yesterday, maybe as of this taping, about this legislation? Do you think it has some type of fighting chance? We always know how Republicans are against, getting some type of gun control, gun reform legislation in front of anybody. And now this is Biden's way of it's not about the guns. It's actually about the kids that create the guns. What do you make of this legislation and the recent presser by the president?
I think Democrats have to push for this. This is something that, their base voters want to see. They want to see action on guns. We just saw in New York, there was another gun incident today. We remember the Sandy Hook tragedy and the tragedy of so many other places and schools where students are being harmed. I couldn't imagine having to go through these drills that students nowadays are having to go to. And, just the difficulty of whether you feel safe at a place that you're at for 8 or so hours a day trying to learn. But when it comes to legislation, I'd be skeptical that Congress would do anything. We've seen in these moments, Congress pushes, Congress talks, Congress may even debate, Congress votes, and at the end of the day, nothing really changes. I don't think that there's anything that should suggest that this dynamic will be different. I think Republicans right now are focused on taking back some power, whether it be the House and or the Senate in 2022. I don't think, pissing off their voters by trying to pass any type of gun reform is a good strategy on their part, even if it may be beneficial for the country and help save lives.
Is there a chance that Biden may think or potentially take a different path? Because we know, obviously, with former President Obama, you referenced Sandy Hook. The action there was to then bring us before Congress, and that common sense hopefully would have prevailed. Obviously, it didn't. But is there the potential that the president may go the different route of potentially exploring executive action?
I think there's a lot of pressure on Biden to start using his pen more. I know a lot of different groups within Congress have met with the president recently. They've been pushing him to take action. Progressives want to see him take action. The Hispanic caucus wants to see him take action. The Black caucus wants to see him take action. The question is, will he actually do this? Or, is the former senator someone, who preaches bipartisanship? Does he want to see Congress move on these issues? And so far it seems like he wants to put it in Congress' hands and let Congress legislate while he remain an executive. But he is facing a lot of pressure. I was at an event with a bunch of senators with Black press maybe 2 weeks ago, and Chuck Schumer and Liz Warren were, telling us to tell everybody to push Joe Biden on student loan debt relief because he can do that with his pen. So they were saying, the way forward is just to pressure Joe Biden to call the White House, to email the White House to make this an issue because he hasn't completely made up his mind on it. But I think he's feeling, similar pressure on a range of issues. Congress is a place where there are a lot of ideas and not really as much legislation that pans out and gets passed and becomes law. And so, President Biden does have the opportunity to use his pen, but then again, once he's out of office, the next president could potentially revoke it. It could go through court challenges, not ever actually take effect. So very murky area. A lot of people have their positions on, how much authority the president really has when it comes to his executive orders. And so the best path forward usually is through legislation, but with a divided government, or it's not really divided since Democrats are in power, but with such narrow majorities, it's hard to really accomplish much, especially on such a divisive issue.
Well, I want to stay on Congress for a second, because I was listening to a podcast recently, one from one of the news outlets, and they were talking about immigration reform, and that there are two senators, one Democrat and one Republican, that are trying to work on something from an immigration reform standpoint, and two from like states that this really impacts. So I was a little bit shocked to hear some of that. And it was from an advocate that was talking about the Trump era policies that the Biden administration may get rid of in terms of migrants and COVID being sent back. So I wanted to ask you, what are some bills or pieces of legislation that you're hearing as you wander these congressional halls that they are working on? Maybe some bipartisan one, maybe one that a Democrat is introducing, a Republican's introducing. Obviously, we just talked about, President Biden on the ghost guns, but this immigration legislation, anything in the voting rights category. What are you hearing about something that maybe could get talked about in the summer months as we head towards the midterms?
My report hasn't focused much on immigration. Recently, what I've just been hearing is, Democrats divided when it comes to the Title 42 policy at the border and whether to allow migrants, seeking asylum into the country. That's been the biggest issue. President Biden took some executive action on that. Well, not executive action, but the CDC announced that would be revoked, I think, later in May. And some Democrats are upset, particularly some vulnerable Democrats who are up for re-election in 2022, as well as, the typical Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. So right now, that's the biggest issue on immigration, just Democrats divided on where they stand on that policy. And Republicans, of course, are continuing to, repeat the rhetoric about Joe Biden and open borders and the dangers, revoking that policy would do for the country, and how there'd be a surge of migrants that the country isn't ready to handle. Just given that political environment, I would be skeptical that any bipartisan agreement that's related to immigration that's significant would come from that, just because of the political environment. Joe Biden's poll numbers are still bad. Republicans still want control. Republicans want to talk about the border. Democrats traditionally don't want to talk about the border. The Republicans are always saying Joe Biden and Kamala Harris should go to the border and do events there. Obviously, they haven't. It's not really an issue they want to focus on right now, and the economy is also not doing so hot. We got the latest numbers on inflation. I think it's at a 40-year high. So I would just be very skeptical that there's any political will or any even timing to, pass something major on immigration. Congress has a lot of recess time scheduled over in the next few months, heading into the November election. So, right now they're focused on a competes bill. They're trying to do something with permanent normal trade relations with Russia and Ukraine, and I think a couple of other issues. So just with all those things on its plate and the pace that the Senate moves at, I just would be very skeptical that, out of the blue, some deal on immigration would come.
Actually, speaking of Russia and Ukraine, Nolan, in the halls of Congress, what is the conversations that you're hearing? Because through television, obviously some of these more political programs, there's sometimes a split where we're having openly, American-based television shows, talking about, both siding this with Russia and Ukraine. In Congress, is there more of a, just, I guess for lack of a better phrase, more of an honest conversation about what's going on with Russia and our response currently to the invasion?
Yeah, I think early on, both parties were trying to score points about President Biden's strategy regarding whether it was the better decision for Joe Biden to wait to impose sanctions so after Russia invaded, or whether he should have done something before then to try to prevent an invasion. But since that moment, you've seen President Zelensky speak to Congress. There's been a lot more unity and bipartisanship when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. There was the anomaly of former President Trump, calling what Putin was doing genius. But all the other Republicans on Capitol Hill, except for maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene and some people, on the far right, they, seem to be working well with Democrats. Their rhetoric is in line with the country. This is traditionally an issue where it should be country first, not party first. You want to be an ally to Ukraine. You want to sympathize with what's going on there. You want to make sure that, the U.S. is able to provide proper resources and equipment, but you also want to make sure that the U.S. doesn't get pulled into war and have to, fight Vladimir Putin's army and, potentially provoke a nuclear war that could claim, many, many lives. So it's tough to watch the news every day and see what's happening in Ukraine. And, people wish they could do something. Members of Congress are going to the Polish border with Ukraine and back and taking trips there. They're constantly being updated and briefed on what's happening. But this has been a rare moment of bipartisanship on Capitol Hill with this issue.
I'm so glad that you mentioned Marjorie Taylor Greene, because last time you were on the pod, you mentioned that you've been trying to do some interviews with Republican congressional members, and it wasn't going so hot. And then Madison Cawthorn comes out with the orgy stuff, and then obviously Marjorie Taylor Greene does her stuff, and then you got Lauren Boebert doing her stuff. I wanted to ask you, to an outsider that is watching this play out on television, to the people that hear this stuff or read these tweets, but you see these people, you see their interactions with other folks on the Hill. Like, what does that look like to everybody? Are these people being disingenuous? Is this the way they truly feel? What is it like covering? Because you wrote recently about Marjorie Taylor Greene in the context of, Ketanji Brown Jackson and how Marjorie Taylor Greene was chastising the Republican senators that voted for the confirmation on the pedophilia stuff. Like, what is it like covering some of that? Because we talk about it a lot on this show. And as a former Fox guy, I know what disingenuous kind of sounds like and looks like. And I feel like some of that is disingenuous, but to the person who's there day to day and sees these people up close and personal, what's your read on that?
So when I'm outside the House chamber, when members are going in and out to vote, you see Marjorie Taylor Greene go in, you see Lauren Boebert go in. They're usually talking to colleagues. They're not isolated and, being stared at like, oh my gosh, here she goes again. It's very collegial, even though a lot of Democrats and Republicans have a lot of tension, especially after January 6th. But when I do see them, I don't really, see them feeling isolated. It does sort of feel like they're kind of playing a role of playing to the base, or just trying to adopt the Trump playbook and, generate attention, generate, retweets, generate TV hits, generate fundraising, and, potentially parlay that into something bigger outside of a seat in Congress. What you just alluded to about Marjorie Taylor Greene's comments on the Supreme Court and saying that the Republicans in the Senate who supported her also support, child pedophiles. I asked Susan Collins about that, and she was laughing before I even finished the question, and was basically arguing that it's off base. That's not the kind of rhetoric that Republicans should have in the party. It's not healthy dialogue. And she said, unfortunately, it was the kind of thing that she expects from someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene. But outside of that tension between, a senator defending herself from a Republican who attacked her for her vote of conscience, it doesn't really seem like they're isolated within the Republican caucus. But I know that Kevin McCarthy is facing a lot of pressure to keep them in line and to keep them quiet. But, they come from the Trump wing of the party. They know how to generate press. They know that, a news value is unusualness. And when you say crazy things, people write about it. People call you out about it. You get the clips played on TV, you're able to fundraise off it. So it just seems like, they've learned from Trump's playbook and they've used it to their advantage. And the way districts are drawn nowadays, it's hard to see them losing a primary unless there's a further right candidate that people like even more. So, unless the lines change in another 10 years, it's difficult to, stop them from doing whatever they're doing. Members will often say, if you don't want them in Congress, then the key is to vote them out. And I don't think that voters in those districts are ready to do that yet.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's important that you all pick up a very important distinction what Nolan just said. And unless I'm wrong on this, our friend and journalist also brought up the evils of gerrymandering and how we're carving up districts, Georgia being a really good example of that. Nolan, I think you just said something that's critically important about what we're seeing from some of the most vocal and cartoonish, for lack of a better phrase, members of the Republican Party, that in a setting in Congress, what your observation is that they're not necessarily about that life. It seems like it may be more of like, for the sake of cameras and Twitter, social media, that there's almost an element of professional wrestling that, like, what's being put out, for media, for our consumption as citizens, isn't necessarily it's not necessarily who they are. That potentially may be a portrayal. You mentioned Trump. That may be the best example, because the book's still out on how much of that nonsense did he actually subscribe to, or did he just say what would get the masses interested?
Yeah, this very subject sort of came up during the Supreme Court confirmation hearings. I think it was Ben Sass who called out some of his colleagues when he was asking Judge Jackson about just the presence of cameras in the Supreme Court room if she were to make it to the Supreme Court, because obviously, as we saw on our TV screens and as I was able to see in person, people change when the cameras come out. Ted Cruz, when it was his turn to speak, he raised his voice, he got loud, he interrupted, he made a spectacle with Dick Durbin, the chair of the committee. Same thing with Tom Cotton. He was aggressive in his questioning. Marsha Blackburn, I believe, was, asking Judge Jackson to define what a woman is. So, there is, I guess, Ben Sass sort of, highlighted the fact that when the cameras are out, people seem to be playing a role. People are trying to raise money. People are trying to get their profile out. And, that's what we see on our TV screens. That's what we see in the news reports. But just in everyday life, when you see members of Congress walking across the Capitol, going to get lunch, going to vote or do whatever, they don't seem to be those characters unless there's a big scrum of reporters around them asking questions. Then maybe you'll see some of what you see on TV. Maybe you see some of what you see on Twitter. But just typically throughout their everyday role, just watching members interact with each other, you don't see, the roles that they seem to be playing outside of Congress.
He is a fantastic reporter over at the LA Times. Follow him on social media. You can see him shooting jumpers at 5:30 in the morning, or you can see him getting on Air Force One to cover the president. Nolan McCaskill, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Continued success, my friend. Keep pounding the drum and keep doing great work over there at the LA Times. Thank you for coming on, man.
I appreciate it. Thank you guys for having me again.